We are going to hear from Priya. Priya Nanjappa works with the national parks, and she works with the national parks and is inspired by her father, who would drive her and her brother around the country to see the same park she cares for today. I love that. She arrived at the National Parks Conservation Association with over 20 years experience in the conservation and science policy. Prior to NPCA, Priya served as commissioner specializing in wildlife, environment, and reclamation for the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, who was appointed by Governor Polis for its inaugural full-time commission. And before that, she was director of operations for a nonprofit organization, Conservation Science Partners, or CSP, and was a program manager for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, where she also served as a national coordinator for partners in amphibian and reptile conservation. Park. She has twice been a mentor for the David H. Smith Postdoctorate Conservation Fellowship Program, and in 2019, Priya was the recipient of the Park Visionary Leader Award, the first woman and second person of color to receive this award. Priya is passionate about inclusivity and equity and diversity, and has applied these in her recent positions where she was able to influence and create beneficial changes in policies and practices. She recently served as a mentor in the inaugural cohort of Next 100 Colorado, designed to help connect Colorado's emerging and seasoned leaders of color through a series of partnerships, network formations, and leadership building. She also really loves toads. Outside of work, you can find her looking for them or just hiking and camping, often with her daughter, who shares her love of the outdoors. Please welcome me and join me in welcoming Priya. Yay! That's your round of applause.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the introduction, and I just want to thank all the organizers and the sponsors for putting on this great conference and for thinking of me as a speaker. I'm really excited to be here. So thank you so much again. My name is Priya Nanjappa, and I, as noted, I work now for the National Parks Conservation Association. I'm the Vice President of Conservation Programs. And so in my department, I oversee our wildlife program, our water, clean air, energy, landscape conservation, conservation science, and also sustainability efforts. So it's a lot of great work that goes on at the National Parks Conservation Association in support of our great national parks and monuments, and really excited to tell you a little bit more about how I came into a career of advocacy. And I'm going to share my screen one moment. Let's see. Okay, I think hopefully I'm going to put it into presentation mode in a second, but hopefully you can see this. And so you can see also at the bottom, as noted, I am a toad lover. There will be a few toads in this presentation. My handle on Twitter is totally Priya. I must say I'm not as active on there as I used to be at one point in time, but you can find me there, and I do post every now and then. But what I wanted to just tell you about today a little bit was my background is in wildlife biology, and I'll talk a little bit about sort of my path, which was somewhat winding, as you may have noted just from the bio that as was read. But I started out in wildlife conservation, but where I am now is more in policy advocacy. And so hopefully I can give you a little bit of a sense of what that's like, go from a career that's mostly science-based, or even as a layperson, and how you can get more engaged in policy advocacy and some of the lessons that I've learned along the way in my 20+ year career now. So with that, I will continue. So much like this turtle on a fence post, it's really kind of a long story how I got here. And I didn't get here by myself. It was with a lot of partnerships and with a lot of people that contributed to the work that I was involved in, and that's really important. And I also just want to acknowledge, I am actually speaking to you all from what is now known as Denver, Colorado, which is the unceded lands of the Arapaho, Ute, Lakota, and Cheyenne peoples. And similar to this turtle, they were not moved willingly from these lands. And it's important for us to acknowledge kind of where we are as we think about landscape conservation, the history, the full and true history of the lands. And that's something that I really try to think about in the work that I do. But for me, coming into conservation really started in my backyard. I grew up in Iowa, and in my backyard, there was always a family of nesting cardinals. And I got to watch them, nesting in my family's tree. And as we would travel across the state, I would often see these red-winged blackbirds as well. And I noticed, how sometimes that beautiful red patch would show and other times it wouldn't. And it just, made me curious and interested. And I just kind of watched, the behavior. But in general, I was just kind of a fan of animals and of wildlife, and love to be outside, love to watch and just kind of observe as I was going through kind of just my day-to-day activities. I grew up in a time where I got to be outside most of the time during good weather, and in the summers, I was just be out until the sun set and got to come back inside, when I heard my mom yelling, or sometimes if the porch lights were flashed. So I was one of those kids. And, I feel really lucky that I got to be, part of that generation where we got to kind of roam free, because that really probably led me in a lot of ways to the career that I have today. So along the way, when I was about 14 years old, I developed friendship with still a good friend of mine today, Emily, who's pictured here. When we were 14, we became friends, and her dad was a really avid bird watcher. So she asked me one day if I wanted to go bird watching with her and her dad. And I had never really done that before, never had done that before. My family was not outdoorsy whatsoever. They like to admire the things, from inside the house. And when we would go to national parks, as mentioned in my bio, we would drive through, go to the scenic overlook, maybe snap a photo or two, and then get back in the car and keep driving. So it wasn't until much later in life that I really figured out ways to spend more time outdoors. But this experience with Emily and her father was really life-changing for me. He had found the nest of a great horned owl in a tree, in a big knothole in a tree. And he took us there, and we waited for a while because he had seen the mother owl coming back in, around this time at night, at dusk, and after, hunting. And we were just waiting for her to return. And so we're sitting in this field, and the house that I grew up in was relatively noisy. There were phone calls, there were just, I don't know, loud conversations in general amongst the family. My mom was like cooking the curry for the evening dinner, and so there'd be onions, sauteing in the pan, and it was just loud, So here I was sitting out there in the field with the winds blowing through the grasses and the leaves, and you could hear, birds chirping and insects buzzing all around. And there was something about that was just really calming for me. And so even though it was sort of noisy in a very different way, it was an interesting noise. It was a fascinating noise, and it really just kind of captivated me. And then after what seemed like quite a while, it probably wasn't all that long, in came Mama Owl. And as she came towards the knothole, all the little chicks kind of came forward into the front of the knothole with their little floofy heads. And I was just in awe immediately. And we just, put our binoculars up and just watched and observed. And truly, I can say that in that moment, it's still such a vivid memory for me more than 30 years later, because I was, it was just made such an impression on me. And in that moment, I decided I needed to have some sort of career where I could work outside and work with animals. So that's kind of how my career began. And I really credit it to Emily. This picture was taken just a few years ago, and we were out bird watching again. And so, again, as noted, I love toads. I befriended a toad in my mom's garden as I was growing up. this little toad would hop around and eat the bugs, and I just kind of would observe it, and it'd come back every year. I'd like to think it was the same toad. It probably wasn't necessarily the same toad, but at some point I built a little half pot, a pot half buried in the dirt of the garden, so that the toad had a little place to go sit and hang out. And I just love toads. They just have these charismatic faces, these frowns, these kind of grumpy looks, these big eyes. What's not to love? And so I've now transmitted this love to the next generation. This is my daughter a few years ago, with the first big fat toad that she found. We were very excited to find this together and capture this moment. And the love affair still continues. This was just last summer. We went out looking for toads again, and here she is with one of the nice toads that she found, and she just really loves them as well. But where I really learned about the ecology and the conservation needs of amphibians and reptiles was at a field lab in Northwest Iowa. So where I started my career, my father was an engineer. He's an immigrant. Both my parents are immigrants from India. They both didn't understand why I was so drawn to the outdoors. They didn't know why I wanted to be outside and why I wanted to be around animals. So I started my undergrad career actually in pre-engineering, driven by my father, to kind of push towards that. And he was like, maybe you could start out in environmental engineering. So I thought, I would try that, but after a year of calc-based physics and analytical chemistry and linear algebra, I was pretty much fried. And I was filling all of my electives with general biology, with ecology, with botany, any courses I could find. And I eventually transferred to Iowa State University, which was a larger field school and had a really great animal ecology and wildlife and fisheries program. And it was there that I stumbled upon this flyer. Even my biology advisor didn't really understand about, sort of wildlife careers. He was much more of a lab kind of guy. And I just happened to find this flyer. I asked him about it. He didn't really know much about it. And so I just looked into it myself. And I ended up spending a summer taking immersive field courses in plant ecology and taxonomy, as well as vertebrate ecology and evolution. And what turned out to be my master's professor taught that vertebrate ecology and evolution course, and he happened to be somebody who really loved amphibians and reptiles. And so a lot of the places we went, you would see a lot of these critters, as well as the birds, as well as the small mammals. So I learned about a lot of different things, but really kind of learned about the ecologies of amphibians and reptiles in that field experience. And and I started to really just kind of explore further, what are the careers in this field? And there weren't too many people that I was encountering at that time that really understood them. And at some point along the way, we had a presentation from somebody from US Geological Survey, and they were talking about amphibian declines. This was a phenomenon that was happening in the mid-90s. And I was, in undergrad at that time, and there were amphibians that were found with malformed limbs, and they were trying to figure out what was happening. This was happening in the Midwest, in Minnesota, not far from where I lived and where I grew up, and where this field lab was. And so my professor was kind of getting involved in that work. Eventually then, in 1999, this program, the Amphibian Research and Monitoring Initiative, or ARMI, was started. And we were kind of doing some collaborative work with these folks. And so then I started to learn about the jobs in research, in amphibian research. I had explored a little bit further about some of the jobs with US Fish and Wildlife Service and the Park Service and other places, and was just trying to understand, what the opportunities that were out there. But really just kind of researching on my own. But I was very fortunate that in that time, because of all of those things that were happening, there were jobs available in amphibian conservation with that ARMI program. And so this is me in the field many years ago, surveying for spotted salamander egg masses. That's one in my hand. And we also were looking for wood frog egg masses, and that was kind of helping us determine the presence of these animals and get a sense of population status in the area. And this was in Maryland. I had worked for many years at the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center in Maryland. And through that work, I got engaged in the Northeast region of Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation. And a few years into my term position with US Geological Survey, it was term limited and there wasn't an opportunity to extend it. This group, Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, was hiring for a state agencies coordinator. So I put in for the position and I was fortunate enough to get it. And what I learned along the way is that putting the animals first, or the goal first, or the effort that you're trying to put forth to conserve the land, conserve the animals, what really works best is to not put yourself in the middle of it. Of course, we all want to be recognized for our work. Of course, we all want to do good things for the critters, for the land, for the plants. But if you don't make it about you and you make it about those things, you can really get a lot further, a lot faster. You can make a lot stronger relationships, partnerships. You can understand the needs of the critters, the needs of the people who are working with the critters, the needs of the policymakers. And you can really understand, what works and what is needed. And that's a better way that you can move forward. And I'll talk further about that. So as I was, oops, I think I'm going the wrong direction. Sorry. So in thinking about the animals and putting them first, you really start to understand, what is it that is needed? A lot of times, the first exposure to some of these critters is, it can be frightening. Maybe they just don't know about them. They don't understand, what their needs are, what their ecological niches that they occupy, what preferences they have for habitat. And the same thing goes in general for land conservation, for plants, for the native habitat. You really, have to understand those things. So here's my daughter, back then, she was pretty unsure about that snake, but a few years later, here she is again. She loves her snakes as well. She's very savvy about, which ones are okay to pick up and which ones are not. And I still have to kind of encourage her to, still be judicious around her friends who are still kind of learning. But, once you kind of can help people understand what those issues are, what the needs are, and to learn to appreciate, what the particular thing is that you love, that you want to try to communicate to other people, including policymakers, you can really get them on board. And so with my career with Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, that position as the state agencies coordinator got adopted by the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, which is based in Washington, D.C. You can see the Capitol there behind my head. And so I got to work in the middle of it all. The Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies is a membership entity, a 501c6 for those of you that know kind of these things. So it's a nonprofit, but it is one that is membership based, and all of the state fish and wildlife agencies all across the country, from the Maryland DNR to the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Division to the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, in all across the country, we're all members of this association. There's also members that are engaged through Mexico and Canada and the various provincial and territorial agencies there, as well as the federal agencies that are kind of have a different membership in there. And so we got to work with a lot of those folks. And the way that the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies got work done was through a bunch of these standing committees. So here's just a smattering of some of the committees that were already in place when I came on board. And one of the things that I was able to accomplish while I was there was to create an amphibian and reptile committee. And what's important about this is that at the end of these meetings twice a year that all of these state fish and wildlife folks in leadership would come to, they would have action items that would be discussed around a big table of all of the different agencies that were represented. And you could bring forward issues and needs, and sometimes there would be a vote about certain actions that might be taken. And so I was able to create this committee and bring it forward and get approval for it. And so then we were able to bring amphibian and reptile issues in front of this this governing body of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And so it was an opportunity to finally raise the profile of these low profile critters, both literally and figuratively, and to be able to talk about their policy needs. And so a lot of this was state level policy, but some of it was also federal policy. And one of the things in working with state herpetologists, so herpetology is the study of amphibians and reptiles, and you might hear me use the short term herps, that's referring to amphibians and reptiles. We found that one of the biggest issues was unregulated collection of amphibians and reptiles. So I'll talk a little bit more about this, but how we manage wildlife differs quite a bit in different types of groups of animals. Amphibians and reptiles were largely unregulated at the time. They still are to a certain extent compared to our game animals, and I'll talk more about that. But I was able to partner with the state herpetologists and biologists, with law enforcement in the states, the conservation law enforcement folks, and those that were in the lead of the non-game or the sort of wildlife divisions, and be able to work with them to understand what it was exactly that they needed. We created this summary document that is, the cover is shown here, that summarized what the regulations were for collecting animals for personal use, whether it was a pet for your child or for exhibit purposes, or whether it was for scientific collection. A lot of great research that happens, requires a scientific permit and from the state, or commercial collection. And so commercial sale of wild animals is still allowed in many states in different forms, but you sometimes needed a permit. And what I learned in creating this report, along with the partnership of all of these state herpetologists and biologists all over the country, was that it varied quite a bit, all across the state. And so I started to think, well, how am I going to reach the leadership? So those were the non-game biologists, the state herpetologists and wildlife biologists who were working with these critters, who kind of understood these issues. But by and large, the leadership in these agencies are people who were coming into those agencies primarily from the game side of the world, from deer, from bear, from fish, and so I had to first understand what it was that they valued. And that was going to be the way that I could approach them. So this quote, apparently it actually comes from a slightly different quote from St. Francis of Assisi, and was modified perhaps by Stephen Covey, who wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. But it's a great quote. First try to understand where other folks are coming from, and then you can better understand the way that you will be understood. And so in general with conservation policy, what I also learned is that in changing or adding new conservation policy, it really takes perseverance. It's a very long process of building these relationships, of convincing people, of working with them to try to understand, the issues and the needs. It takes a lot of people. And, I'm really proud of all the partnerships that I was able to build in this time, and trying to, help convince people what was needed. But also those people pulled a lot of weight. They gave me the information on what was happening in their own state. There were a lot of researchers, academic researchers, that were providing data. It takes a lot of time and effort and man hours, people hours. And it takes passion. You have to be really engaged in the issue, but it also involves compassion. And that's, again, kind of understanding where other people are coming from. So again, in thinking about these needs for the policy to better regulate this commercial sale of amphibians and reptiles, and even some of the personal collection in some of these cases, what I found that was really resonating among all of the state leadership was this North American model for wildlife conservation. This is the basic underlying concept under our modern wildlife management today. It's the idea of game licenses or hunting licenses in order to remove a wild deer or to remove a wild fish. You have to have a permit for that purpose, and that allows for tracking. It allows for setting of limits and all of those other things. But that didn't exist for amphibians and reptiles. And there's other critters that the same thing applies to. There's plants, it's the same sort of idea. But what I learned is this could be applied more broadly to other non-game wildlife like amphibians and reptiles, especially because there was a community that was using these critters. So there was the use for food. There's still a lot of subsistence use of turtles and frogs. There was a commercial use, as I mentioned, and a lot of that was still unregulated. There is a use for skins, alligator skins, snake skins, things like that. And so there was a real opportunity to apply this model, and more than anything, to appeal to the leadership of these agencies by saying, you are managing the use of your deer, your bear, your elk, et cetera, in these ways that you can really track and understand what's happening to them. But we don't have a good sense of what's happening to these amphibians and these reptiles. And so therefore, how are we able to truly manage for them? And that was still part of that is the charge of the state Fish and Wildlife agencies, is to manage for all of these wildlife species. So along the way, a colleague stumbled upon this figure, and I thought, what a great way to visualize why there is a challenge for amphibians and reptiles. And in particular, we were focusing on turtles, because turtles, I've said before, if you've heard the term, the tragedy of the commons, this is what happened in the early 1800s, 1900s, when overhunting became a thing. We were almost out of deer, which is crazy to think about in the Northeast with white-tailed deer. They're everywhere. They're kind of a pest now. Canada geese, same thing. They're everywhere. But these populations had really dwindled to a time, and a lot of that was because of the commercial trade in these critters, understanding kind of what was actually going out of the wild system. But along with that, you have to understand their life history. So if you've been looking at this chart as I'm talking, what you're really seeing here, and hopefully you can see my cursor, we've got a snapping turtle on the left side, we've got bear, moose, and deer in these different columns. And in the time that it takes a snapping turtle to finally get to sexual maturity where they can lay a clutch of eggs, a bear has reproduced itself over 25 times. So in other words, there's been at least 25 generations. It may only be a couple of bear each generation, but it's reproduced itself that many times over. In that same time frame for moose, you will have had 681 moose that in that same time frame of it's about 17 years that a snapping turtle reaches sexual maturity. So you could have produced that many more moose and over 900 deer. And so you can kind of think about this in terms of wildlife management. This is how these managers are thinking about setting limits and things like that. So, you can remove quite a few moose and quite a few deer from the system, and the system can still continue reproducing itself. You can still have a lot of animals in the system, even if you're removing them. And so you have these permits that you allow for the removal of these deer or the bear or the whatever. But with a snapping turtle, a lot of people will say, oh, they seem so abundant, but what you might be seeing are the large adults. You may not be seeing how many young turtles are coming into the system. And because they take so long to mature, because they're very secretive, same is true for a lot of reptiles and amphibians as well. You don't really know for sure unless you're actually monitoring. And so that really resonated with a lot of folks in kind of describing why we had to have a better sense of regulation for these critters. So what I was able to do, again, along with a ton of partners, a lot of people that were involved in this, was create a set of recommendations of applying that North American model of wildlife conservation to herpetofauna, or amphibians and reptiles. And we introduced this back in 2014. And what I learned in that process was my next insight, which is emotional intelligence. What I mean by that is that sometimes people are going to react to you in ways that have absolutely nothing to do with what you're talking about, or who you are, or what you're saying, or how you're saying it. But it sure feels like that in the moment. They're reacting like what you're saying is crazy. You don't know what you're talking about. You're attacking their way of thinking or their way of managing. And those were some of the comments I was getting as I was introducing this initially amongst these leadership in the States. And what I learned, from that was more about them. There was something that they were feeling that was threatening, or maybe they were just having a bad day. But that's what I've learned as I've approached other people in leadership in agencies, politicians, is that sometimes the way they react has absolutely nothing to do with you. And you have to be able to just kind of, hold your ground and just listen, or maybe just decide, okay, well, thank you for your time. I'll come back another day. So those are the types of things that are really important in political advocacy. And so I share that with you here. Along with that comes with this idea of getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. When you are advocating for policy, sometimes you're going to have these uncomfortable conversations because you often are going to have to talk to people that may not necessarily be on the same page with you, or may not be there right at that moment. And it is really important to be okay with that discomfort. People can get very anxious. I know I definitely would get more anxious. I would get uncomfortable. And when, sometimes certain people, especially politicians, they sense that anxiety, that discomfort, that weakness, for lack of a better word, and then they will start kind of throwing other things at you, and you kind of can get really thrown off. So if you can learn in advance that you might be uncomfortable, you might need to be prepared for tough questions or different questions, and you can just kind of stay on your message and say, I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking about this. What we really need to do is focus on this. That's the kind of thing that will get you where you're going. So in general, with growth comes discomfort, right? You've always heard of growing pains. This is a true fact in any sort of aspect of growing professionally, personally, and even in doing things like political advocacy. So sticking with this theme, sometimes your partners are not your friends. And I don't know how well you can see this image here, but right here is a rattlesnake. So you can probably see that rattlesnake tail, and there's a rattlesnake in a burrow here, but sitting on top of that rattlesnake is a woodhouse's toad. A friend and I found this, saw this here in Colorado and took this picture. But probably what we think was happening there is that toad was using the snake for warmth. Maybe the snake had been out basking, and the toad maybe was already in the burrow or came into the burrow, and the snake was nice and warm, so just sat on that snake. But obviously these are not critters that hang out together on a regular basis, as far as we know. And so sometimes to accomplish the thing you need to accomplish, you have to approach the people that you don't share the same philosophies with, that you don't agree with. Maybe they've taken a stance on something else that you're completely opposed to, but you still have to engage them. And so that's where, again, the emotional intelligence, the being comfortable with being uncomfortable comes into play. And so sometimes as well, the people that are your biggest hurdle to moving an action forward are also your biggest opportunity. So if you can figure out the strategy to engage with a person, maybe you find something that you have, that you learned that they took a stand on that you agree with. So you start there, you just kind of start talking with them, start building that rapport, that relationship, or in general, just talk to folks about the things that that they already care about. They're going to be more willing to learn more about what you care about once you kind of develop that relationship. So again, as I said before, perseverance is the key. But I really appreciate this quote. Sometimes that's the impediment. It's the impediment to the action that actually is going to be the way forward. And if you can figure out a way to move that barrier or break it down a little bit, then you might be able to move forward. And so in the example of applying the North American model to herpetofaunal conservation, there was one particular person, and he was in a leadership role when I was presenting this, in the group. And here I am. At that time, I was maybe in my, mid-30s or something, in front of a room of a lot of folks who were in their 50s or older, leaders of state agencies, had been in the field for many years. And I'm presenting this information, and this one leader who's very influential, he says, "I don't like this. You're challenging my way of management. You're telling me I'm doing a poor job." And of course, I wasn't saying any of that. I was just saying, hey, here's an idea, and here's some suggestions, and here's some recommendations. And again, this came from a whole bunch of other people. And I will say also in that moment, what was really interesting is nobody stood up with me to say to him, hey, let's think about this a little bit differently. What about this, or what about that? And so instead I said, is it something about the way we're saying things? Is it something about what we're saying? And he just said, I don't like it. So I was like, okay, fair enough. We'll rework this, or I'll talk to you separately and we'll come back. And so I did work with him directly, and I had a bunch of individual conversations along with some other people as well. And ultimately we were able to get this approved, and his approval was a key part of that. So again, the impediment to the action was the way forward, and I just had to be, I had to persevere, I had to be persistent. But we got that approved, and I have to say I'm really proud of this whole process, because a lot of states since that time have tightened their regulations on commercial collection. They've evaluated, kind of their population status, and kind of rethought about this quite a bit more. And so, all this time I was working with partners in amphibian and reptile conservation. I was part of our strategic planning process, and we updated our mission statement, which you can read here. But I just love this photo because, sometimes you're the gator and sometimes you're the turtle. Again, two animals that don't typically hang out. But, what they're really doing here is they're sharing the sunshine, and both of them can bask. They can work together to get what they need. So, those proactive partnerships are really a key part of political advocacy. And again, especially when you're approaching someone that you might not share those philosophies with, you're not really sure about, you can find that sliver of common ground. It might be the tiniest little bit that you share, that you agree with and that you have in common. But that's the point at which you can start out, and you can find that path forward. You can start building that relationship. You can start building that trust. I had another colleague in Missouri that was trying to work with a private landowner, and it was related to snake conservation. And of course, snakes are very unpopular. It's really hard to find people, to be able to do anything, good for them, especially on their land, because of fear and because of other things. But if they are, if you approach them and develop a relationship, and what this colleague of mine did was he just went over every day and brought coffee for this older gentleman landowner, and they would just sit on the porch, and they would just talk about, sports, or talk about the land, or talk about, the plants or the crops. And he did that over and over and over for months. And then finally, he was able to start talking about some of the other wildlife, things, some of the programs that were available that could help this private landowner, to be able to accomplish some of the wildlife conservation or the land conservation that would benefit the wildlife. And they were able to make progress. So it's finding that common ground, it's establishing that trust, that relationship, and that's a really important part. Uh-oh, my screen has frozen. What is happening? Uh-oh, okay, there we go. So also in that strategic planning process with Park, we updated our vision statement. And, what I think is important here are the pieces in bold. And that is that we just wanted to work together with those who are making the decisions to consider these critters, these amphibians and reptiles, in their decision-making, in their land management actions. We had people in the same agency that were doing one action that was completely in opposition to the needs of the amphibians and reptiles. And in some cases, these were even imperiled species. And, it's helping them understand. And sometimes they just didn't know that. And then you just talk to them. But if you go at them, saying what you're doing is wrong, and what you're doing is hurting these, these critters, and you're supposed to be a land manager, how, if you come at them, guns blazing, of course, you're not going to get a good response. So instead, you come together, you think about what you have in common, you think about where are the places that you can work together, and then you start your messaging based on that. And then you can maybe get them to at least consider it. And at least that's a starting point. Not that long ago, migratory birds, songbirds, were in demand for their feathers, for the fashion industry. And there was a lot of, meetings and regulations that went into place. And of course, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, some of you may be familiar with, that was a huge thing because that was a federal law that was passed. But, that got migratory birds considered at pretty much the same level now that deer and bear and fish are being considered. And we're getting a little closer with amphibians and reptiles. And I think that's really great with the partnerships that Park has really helped to establish. So one of the other examples I wanted to give you was with this disease of salamanders that was just described in 2013. And here's the paper that described this new disease called Batrachochytrium salamander vorans. And no, there won't be a quiz on this, but we call it B-sal for short. It's a new pathogen that is very similar to another chytrid fungus that you may have heard of, which is called Batrachochytrium dendrobatidis. And it was thought to only infect frogs, but also had some impact on certain salamander species. But this one in particular seemed to be really like a salamander specialist. We know now that it does actually impact certain frog species, but what was happening with this is this was a new pathogen, new to science. It was causing the demise of salamanders in parts of Europe to where the wild populations were almost like more than 90% extirpated, 96% wild mortality in the Netherlands. It was present in wild salamanders in Asia, in Vietnam and Thailand and Japan, but they had apparently evolved with it. And so they had become resistant to it. It was not causing mortality there. And so the question was, how did it come to the Netherlands? What was happening? We knew that it had been around for over 150 years in museum specimens. But what we also found that it was present in the commercial trade of some of these salamanders, and also in some captive populations. So we figured out that B-sal was a threat because, especially to the United States, because a few years ago, over 100,000 salamanders were being annually imported into the United States. And they were primarily these Asian newt species, which are some of those that can harbor this B-sal pathogen and not die. But we found that North American species were susceptible. So there was a big bunch of partners that started to come together and share information, share their research, and try to understand what they could do to stop the progression of this disease into the United States. And when you think about the risk here in the United States, we have a lot of salamanders in the United States. You may not have known, but the United States is the global one of the global salamander hotspots. In fact, in the Carolinas and in the Appalachians, so here you can see here in North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, Virginia, are amongst the most speciose, or the most number of species of salamanders exist in those states. So when you see these numbers here, we're not talking about 60 individual salamanders, we're talking about 60 species of salamanders. So that's how many salamanders were potentially at risk. And so we needed to find out more information, which ones were at risk, what were the biggest threats, how, what could we do and how could we find out? But in order to do that, obviously you needed resources, you needed, other protections. We needed to halt that trade coming into the United States. So what did I do? I went over to Senator Richard Burr's office. He was a senator in North Carolina. He also was a head of the Appropriations Committee at the time. And so there was an opportunity to kind of, talk to him and his staff about this issue and letting them know that, look, in your state, you have the most salamander species in the world. If these salamanders started to decline to the point where you needed an Endangered Species Act listing, the forestry industry in your state would be highly compromised. The development industry for developing homes and et cetera would be highly compromised. And so again, finding like, what is that thing that they valued that they would need? This is a conservative Republican, and there were positions that were probably not very favorable to wildlife that he had taken in the past. But it was important to come to him and to say, look, this is your state. These are your animals. These are your industries that are going to be at deep risk if we don't do something about this. And so staff from his offices, from some of those other states that I noted there, California is another state that has a lot of salamander species. We started talking to them, and that really catalyzed some efforts. They began talking to some of the federal agencies. In the meantime, we were also researching, what the opportunities were. But in all of this, I had to approach some of these politicians that, again, maybe hadn't taken, strong stances on wildlife conservation in the past. And, you just have to remember that, not everybody is going to be perfect in their records. And so again, you may have these differing philosophies, but you have to work on this together. And so with a lot of time and effort, we learned in particular that there weren't any policies on the books to prevent a pathogen coming in that was from wildlife and would only affect other wild animals. We do have policies currently that the CDC manages for a wild animal disease that can infect humans. And we've seen that, with West Nile virus, with there's the potential, there's always the potential risk with avian influenza. There's a swine flu, a couple of other things like this that can start with a wild animal, but can move to human populations. So we have policies through the CDC and regulations that can occur that way. We have regulations within the US Department of Agriculture that will prevent diseases of wild animals that would potentially affect agricultural animals. So again, avian influenza is a big one right now. You probably have been hearing, it's affecting other wild animals, but it's also the reason that it's gotten so much attention is because it affects poultry. It affects our farm populations. And so there's a particular pathogen that's carried through a tick on a tortoise that comes into the United States and is screened for because it can create an issue for livestock and for our cattle in this country. And so there are all these screening processes in place. There's controls, there's management for those tortoises that are coming into the United States. But what we learned is there's no policy at all for diseases of wildlife that get transmitted to wildlife. So some of you might be familiar with white nose fungus. This was the disease of bats that was killing a lot of bats in the Northeast in the beginning, and now has spread to many parts in the West. And what we learned was that there was a very similar pathogen in Europe. But again, even if we had known that at the time, by the time we were sort of discovering it, it was already spreading a bit too fast. But had there been a way to prevent the movement of animals somehow, or even the movement of people, or regulations for cavers to clean their boots or things like that, there wasn't any policy authority to be able to put those things in place because the risk was only from wildlife to wildlife. So we had to figure out a workaround. And what we learned was that the Lacey Act, which is a law that has been on the books for over 100 years now, it has a provision for injurious wildlife. And that is the idea of listing an animal that can be injurious, especially to agricultural interests or to other interests in that we have, especially industries around. But it has been used more and more. There have been precedents for invasive species. So there was no way to stop this pathogen, B-Sal pathogen, or to screen animals for this pathogen. But what we could do was block the entry of the host animals by listing the host animals as injurious wildlife. So a lot of us worked on this. We talked about it. I ended up talking to folks in the aquaculture industry, in zoos and aquariums, and similar other disease issues in the past, especially involving amphibians, had been discussed with them. They were very against that because in those other instances, these were pathogens that were already found in the United States. And so the cat was kind of already out of the bag. They were like, you can't really stop this now, so it doesn't make sense for us to get on board with this. But in this instance, this B-Sal pathogen, there was a lot of research that was happening, monitoring that was happening, and we were not finding it yet in the United States, thank goodness. And so far, that's still the case. So we were able to block the entry of these salamanders with support of the aquaculture industry, with support of the pet industry, with support of the zoos and aquariums. And it was only because of all of these partners that typically, haven't always worked together, that we were able to influence the Fish and Wildlife Service to work more quickly and to put this rule into place. So in 2016, they released this listing of several hundred salamander species, especially those that were heavily in trade. And, you know, would like to think that that is part of the reason that it still has not been detected in this country. And I wasn't expecting this, had no idea it was going to happen, but they cite me in the rule as somebody that they spoke to, you know, for why we needed to, you know, include certain species in this rulemaking. And I'm, again, just really proud. It was not about me, but in doing that, in bringing all these people together, in talking to them and sharing information, you know, they noticed, and I'm just super humbled and grateful. Truly had no intention of, you know, anything related to me being part of that. I just wanted to see this disease not come into the country and not take out a lot of our great salamander species that we have here. For those of you in the Northeast that might be familiar with your amphibians, red spotted newts, the little red F's you might see sometimes walking around in the rain in the woods. Those are a very highly susceptible species. And so, you know, can you just imagine if you wouldn't see those out wandering around? That was one of the things that was really driving me, you know, forward with this. But along with that, you know, with some of this policy work that I was doing, I got invited to speak in a tri-national convention with Mexico, Canada, and the United States about turtle trade and about turtle regulation policy. And so, you know, working in all these sort of policy and knowing some of these levers that you could pull or what the opportunities are to potentially influence policy, you know, got me invited to this meeting. And that's led to some additional protections for some of the turtles that are in trade. And then it's also led to a lot of really fun stuff. These are some of the podcasts that I've been able to be a part of, or other interviews that I've gotten to do, or presentations like this. And now I'm really happy I can add the Ecological Landscape Alliance to my list of groups that have found me along the way and have invited me. I'm just really honored to, you know, be able to share in some of these things that I've learned. And as mentioned in the intro, you know, I was given the 2019 Visionary Leader Award for Park. And that was just such a huge honor for me because, again, you know, I was just trying to create these policies and these structures for these critters, but it was getting recognized. And what one of my colleagues said in giving me the award was that I was a keystone species for park. And for those of you that know wildlife ecology, you know what a keystone species is. But if you don't know that, at least maybe you can recognize that the keystone is that central stone in the arch, like of a bridge or any arch structure. And that keystone is the one that's in the middle that's holding up the rest of the stones. But the way I like to think about it is if it wasn't for the rest of those stones, that keystone would just fall right into the water. So even though they were calling me the keystone, I couldn't have done it without the support of all of those other folks and all of the other partners. And, you know, again, I think that's really cool that they, you know, made that analogy. But, you know, one thing that I've really tried to do in my career is think about the ways that I can bring others up. And the way that I think I have risen is by lifting other people up with me along the way, giving them opportunities. And I just encourage you all to think about the ways that you can mentor, that you can guide, that you can help convey the lessons that you're learning along the way, and lift up those, you know, especially those who may not always get the same opportunities to learn in school, to go to the best schools, to get the field school opportunities, you know, to do those kinds of things. One of the ways that came into play for me is when I was with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, I had an intern that was working with me on some of the regulations and collecting the information. And she came to work at the state of Colorado in the DNR. And so they were recruiting people for a wildlife habitat committee that was to be able to help determine how grants were distributed across the state. And she, in her policy role, was able to recommend to the head of the DNR to contact me and invite me to this position. So here is my intern who, you know, rose into this great role. She got into a lot of the policy work after some of the work that we did. She then thought back about me and a way to bring me into another opportunity. And that led to me getting, you know, recognized through the Department of Natural Resources and becoming an appointee through the governor for the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission in their wildlife and environment seat, which was a 2-year appointment, and it was a really incredible and huge learning experience. And I, hope I did some good for the wildlife and the environment here in Colorado. We were able to set some new rules, and so then I got to be a decision maker and apply kind of some of the things that I learned in advocacy towards the decision making, and now that's made me even a better advocate. Am I going backwards again? Oh no, sorry, I lost my train of thought. So again, just kind of remembering the ways that those common ground opportunities, those opportunities to bring others into the fold, to understand others, and then to be understood, this actually applies a lot in thinking about the ways that you can mentor people as well. You can bring them into the fold. You can think about the ways that people differ from you as being opportunities to learn from one another, to exchange ideas, to give them opportunities. And I've gotten a lot involved in equity and diversity and inclusion, and I know I'm running out of time. And one of the ideas of inclusion is to kind of integrate something in to a space that it was otherwise would have been excluded or marginalized. And what I learned in some of this policy, especially with amphibians and reptiles, is amphibians and reptiles are kind of an excluded or marginalized group in the wildlife world. So the policies that I was creating were policies and acts of inclusion. And a lot of our policy and advocacy work is that way as well. I'm going to skip through this a little bit, but just the idea that equity is not the same as equality. You have to be able to think about the needs of different entities, but how they can all work together and how they can thrive. And we all may know a little bit about biodiversity and how the variety in an ecosystem, different structures, different habitat types, different animals, really creates a thriving ecosystem. And the same thing is true for diversity in general, diversity in the groups that we have, not just ethnic and racial diversity, but diversity in views of thought, in perspectives, in experiences, life experiences, economic backgrounds. You would be amazed the types of things, the types of insights that people can bring just from having a different way of growing up, a different way of living, a different experience, a different culture, how that can really contribute to the richness of your efforts and your work. So now with the National Parks Conservation Association, in the vice president role that I have, before I was really trying not to rock the boat, but now I'm in the lead and I'm steering the boat. That's my daughter there in the boat photo in front, kind of steering the boat. And I'm really hopeful that, with all of these ideas and insights, I'm learning about the ways that policy, that equity, that inclusion, they all sort of work together, and their ideas and thoughts that are important to incorporate in your policy and advocacy efforts. And so I hope that was helpful for all of you. I know I'm a little bit over, but I don't know if there's time for questions, but would love to answer any.
That was wonderful, Priya. Thank you. That was so great. And also, I want to add good graphics. That's another one. We had really captivating slides and pictures, and it really, it illustrates the insight. So I definitely appreciated that. Let me just, since it's 5 o'clock or a little bit past, I'm just going to go through the housekeeping and say the end of the day thing, and then we can stick around for questions. So I'll take a minute, not even. So I just want to tell you all, you can stay with us in this room for questions after, but I wanted to thank you for attending these past 2 days. It's been really wonderful. We've really appreciated your participation. And to ask you to make sure you fill out the evaluations. You can go back to the main stage and you can see all the evaluation tabs for each of the presentations. So we really appreciate that feedback and we use that. So if you could take a moment to do that, we'd appreciate it. Also, thank you again to our sponsors. Shout out to Pleasant Run Nurseries, Understanding Ag, Soil Health Academy, Ernst Seeds, and the Tick Suit. So thank you very much for your support. And there is going on now until 5:30 in the networking rooms, the regional networking rooms. There's a happy hour. So feel free to go there and talk to some folks. Or stay here with us where we are going to talk a little bit more to Priya. All right. Okay, that's done. I just wanted to say that it was interesting. I've taught a little bit in college adjunct world, right? And so in the classroom versus outside of the classroom, totally different, right? Like people that were falling asleep in class, you bring them outside, and
Yep.
all of a sudden they have a million questions. And so as you were talking, I was thinking about policy work and then field work and how, like boardrooms, agencies, committees versus being in the field and,
Yeah.
finding toads. Like, how does that, I don't know, like, I feel like you are demonstrating that one definitely feeds the other, but I just maybe you want to mention that.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, it, it sort of goes along with what I was saying, I think just generally life experiences, can really contribute to, the richness of how you approach the next thing. And having that, field experience and kind of understanding some of those different ecosystem sort of components in the science side of things, and then moving into the policy world and, all the while kind of a lot of the work having to revolve around relationships, and communication and messages, which I think is also kind of part of teaching as well, sort of figuring out what resonates and, what you see, works with communicating and the message, actually landing with your audience. It's all relative. I think the one thing that was interesting for me though, too, is that as much as I loved being outdoors and being in the field, I was one of the few of my other colleagues who actually wanted to be around people more. And so I think a lot of field biologists, go into it because then they can kind of be apart from people and, be on their own and work very independently. But I actually really loved, the opportunity once I got into the policy work to work with people.
That's great. That's great. And speaking of people, let me invite if anyone would like to unmute themselves and join into the conversation, please feel free to do that. There was a great comment earlier, putting the work first, putting the animals first. That's a really good piece of advice. It opens so many doors when you kind of think about that first before your own. So loved that.
That's great. Yeah, I think it was somewhat unintentional. And at the same time, I've really realized how that can be really beneficial in what I observe in, sometimes certain colleagues, sometimes some of, my own staff, is this real desire to be out front and show everybody what they can do. And you can do that by the work, by doing good work, by building good relationships. And I think that's a really important piece of just leadership in general.
There was a question about the salamanders when you were talking about, you mentioned the trade. So yes, those were kind of big numbers. Why were so many imported to the US?
That's a great question. I think there was just a really big pet trade, and there weren't any regulations or limitations. So, and at the time there were no concerns, so nobody had a problem with it. A lot of these, animals are also coming from, developing countries. And so I think, those countries also didn't have much in the way of regulation or maybe even, wildlife policy. And certainly, the US is very different in the way we approach wildlife policy compared to other places. But I was shocked as well, to see that there's hundreds of thousands of salamanders, but you would actually be amazed. It is orders of magnitude higher when it comes to amphibians, to frogs, especially for live trade, for frog legs, and things like that. So it's sadly, I've learned that American bullfrogs are being farm raised in Asia and then imported back here. So yeah, that's a whole nother topic for another day. But yeah, it's still pretty massive.
Hi, Priya. It was really great listening to you. I'm out in Brooklyn, New York, and so we have a botanical garden, and I'm an animal rehabber, and we have a turtle sanctuary. And I think it's the only one in the New York area, anything near. So, we're showing kids native turtles, and it's like I'm showing them something from another planet. They've never ever seen them. So we're just, we're really in our infancy and we have this program, but I'd love to reach out for you for any help that you could have. We have box turtles, we have a couple of the native species, but we want more, and we really want to advance our sanctuary so that it's, more interesting with this, with the different things. And I want to try to introduce, yesterday they had a whole great thing on vernal ponds, you know what they are. So we had a whole talk on that yesterday. This guy was brilliant. And I have a vernal pond, but I want to put more into that, talk about how important they are with toads and amphibians. And also, the spadefoot toad is native to the Brooklyn area. It's pretty dry here, and I think the spadefoot toad can take that. So so anyway, if you don't mind me reaching out to you, maybe for more information on some of this stuff. And yesterday, I'm an animal rehabber, and yesterday we were just quickly. Yesterday, this poor girl couldn't keep this guy anymore, so I have a big Sulcata tortoise.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, he's 7.5 pounds. She brought him in and I was like, oh my God, but people love tortoises, right? So I just wanted to show you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So
I'm happy to help out if I can, and probably even, point you to some of the other folks that I know in the area. One of the great things about the work that I've done is I have a pretty broad network of folks that I have worked with in different ways in the past, and but happy to help with that. And with this tortoise that you just noted, the pet trade is there's a lot of great things about it in terms of the ways that it could educate people about critters, but especially when you're talking about like these turtles and iguanas and some of these animals that live very, very long lives. I think a lot of people don't realize when they purchase them that they're going to have them, beyond their kids' college, graduation, wedding, and and everything else. And so
that's what I say to them. When I say to them, it's a 40-year commitment, because they're all talking, and then they're immediately that's a game changer. Once I say it's a 40-year commitment, the parents are like, okay, yeah, that's never happening. Right. So once they get a little information on, it's not a rat. 2 years, you have a wonderful life with it. You know what I mean? But 40 years. So we're trying to do that too. And the red ear slider in the Northeast is through the roof. Every pond is filled with them. So, but it was really, everything you said was great and very, very inspiring. And it is just about that click when you're young. Anyway, I had the same thing where you're just like, okay, this is it. And then it never changed. I was the same way. It just never changed. Some people it changes. They like that for a while, but I had the same thing. And I grew up in Brooklyn in an apartment building, with none of that. So I'll reach out to you because we really want to, there's nothing like this here, and it's so important. And the other thing is people love turtles.
They do. That is true.
Yep. So they're an easy sell. To really educate people about how important they are.
Yep. So true.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I love that slide that showed the different podcasts and other ways that you're reaching out and sort of, doing that advocacy on a larger scale to all these different audiences. And did just listen to the ologies. That's so much fun. I recommend it to everybody.
Well, that's just pure silliness. There's no lessons in advocacy.
Oh, I learned some things about toads.
Oh, good. I'm so, I do. It was a fun one. So I'm glad for those of you who have seen it or heard it, I should say.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for all the lessons. They were, they applied to, your practice, but they were very widely applicable. So we all
thank you.
Use them. So,
happy. I just noticed another question in the chat. I don't know if you want to, I don't want to extend if you need to shorten.
No, go ahead.
I just saw this one about plants and the North American model, which is a great question. So native plants are a really difficult thing in terms of regulatory authority. And what I mean by that is, laws and rules and all that kind of stuff. They have to be rooted in some sort of piece of legislation, whether it's state or federal or maybe even county level policy or something like that, that gives an agency the ability to set laws or regulations to manage a certain thing. So like I said, amphibians and reptiles are technically considered wildlife, broadly. There's a few exceptions in certain states in like a particular type of, whether it's amphibian or reptile or whatever, that they don't consider wildlife, or maybe they consider them game, or maybe they consider them bait in some states. But that was part of, the whole conversation. And when it comes to plants, there's a lot of agencies, state fish and wildlife agencies, or state fish, wildlife, and parks agencies. There's a few of those around the country where they do consider plants as part of their management authority, but it varies from state to state. And so it really just depends on where you are. But even then, I don't know that they have the ability yet, or maybe at all. And maybe it does, maybe there are some in some states to regulate the collection of like native plants and things like that. I know there have been some federal efforts with like ginseng and, a couple of other plants that have been, highly in demand in the commercial trade, similar kind of story, but on the plant side of the world and things like that, that they're trying to figure out some better broad scale regulations, but I don't know as much about that. Similarly with invasive species, invasive plants, invasive animals, what I found was that, these agencies, when it comes to like invasive animals, they have the authority to regulate for their native animals and manage for them, but they didn't always have any ability to place any controls on like the movement or the bringing in of invasive animals. And so a lot of different states were kind of trying to figure those things out for other purposes. And it also applies to some of the disease concerns. But anyway, so I guess the short story is that it varies quite a bit. And so you may just have to look at your local state Department of Agriculture, or your state Fish and Wildlife Agency may be able to tell you more.
Great. One more question here. So it says, oftentimes advocacy can be quite exhausting to pursue. So how do you maintain momentum or reconnect with your why to continue self-motivating?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think generally speaking, whatever the cause might be, I think for most of us that engage in this work, if it's important today, it's going to be important tomorrow. It's going to be important next year. It's going to be important in 5 years, and so maybe you have to think, okay, maybe right now, and a lot of times like some of the calculus that we undertake at NPCA is, okay, that the House of Representatives just shifted, so this strategy that we were using before, we're going to have to shift to a different strategy. So we have to regroup and we have to rethink. We have to get to know some people, see whether or not they're going to be amenable to having, conversations about these kinds of things. What are their views on this particular topic? What are their views on more generally like landscape conservation, or in our case, parks or wildlife, or, things like that. And finding, those places of common ground. But it's an ongoing, strategy effort, to stay with the work. But I think, the biggest thing I can say is that if you feel like you're not getting anywhere, the best thing to do is just to regroup, reevaluate, maybe think about like, are there other partners that maybe you could work with that have had other successes, or are there, other voices that you could bring to the table that might be able to influence things more. But yeah, I think it's a perseverance,
Yeah. Great.
All right. Well, thank you all. I really appreciate this opportunity. Great to be with all of you. I'm sorry I can't participate in the happy hour. I have to run to another meeting, unfortunately. But I really appreciate the time with all of you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for a great conference. See ya.